Good evening, and welcome back to the latest edition of the Fourscore Speaker Series. I'm Jamie Stout, Director of Membership for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. We hope this finds you well, safe at home, and looking forward to the holidays. Tonight, we are joined by our friends and members of the African American History Museum. Both Bob Davis and I are members and support their efforts, and we look forward to future collaborations with them as well. This will be our final presentation of 2020. And I just couldn't think of a better way to wrap up this year than to invite you to learn a little bit more about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born in 1817. He is a central figure in the United States and African American history. Douglass escaped from slavery in 1838 and rose to become a principal leader and spokesperson for the U.S. abolition movement. He would eventually develop into a towering figure for the U.S. civil rights movement. Douglass was a prominent activist, author, public speaker, and continued to push for equality and human rights until his death in 1895. Tonight, we are joined by Bob Davis. Bob and his wife, Pat, are well known in the community as historical interpreters. You likely recall Pat from Sojourner Truth and Mary Elizabeth Bowser. Bob has taken a great interest in telling the story of Frederick Douglass and the U.S. colored troops for some time now, and we're excited to bring his talents to you. As always, we entertain questions throughout the night, so please type those in the Q&A box below, and we'll get to as many as possible after Bob's presentation. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Bob Davis as Frederick Douglass as he speaks to the recruitment of the U.S. colored troops.
Frederick Douglass and the United States colored troops. I advocated aggressively for colored men to fight in the Civil War, stating repeatedly that a war undertaken and brazenly carried on by rebellious slaveholders for the perpetual enslavement of colored men, called logically and loudly for Black men to help suppress it. Tonight, I will highlight excerpts from 4 of my speeches and excerpts from President Lincoln's proclamation of emancipation as they relate to this topic. Together, they provide insights and illustrates the importance of leadership and the determination of Black men to fight for their freedom and for the destruction of slavery. But first, let me tell you, or let me share with you some important facts about myself. I was born a slave on February 18th near Tuckahoe in Talbot County, Maryland, and grew up largely without my immediate family. I remember seeing my mother only a handful of times. She was a slave and my father, a white man unknown to me. At the age of 6, my grandmother, a midwife, took me to the slave quarters. There, I saw one of my aunts being whipped severely by the plantation overseer. He beat her, he whipped her until her back was bloody. He whipped to make her scream, and he whipped to make her hush. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the entrance of the hell of slavery. Sophia Alt, of whom I later served as houseboy, taught me the alphabet. About the age of 11, her husband, Hugh Alt, made her stop because it was illegal in the slave state of Maryland to teach a slave to read. I realized at that point that if it is illegal to teach a slave to read, then it must be important for a slave to learn to read. Realizing that reading was important, I bartered with some poor white boys in my Baltimore neighborhood, trading food, bread, and sandwiches for their knowledge. At the age of 16, already demonstrating my independent spirit. I was sent to toil on the farm of a slave breaker, Ed Covey. To break my spirit, Covey would beat me for no apparent reason. Finally, I rebelled and turned on Covey, fighting back, hitting, and beating him in a vicious fight. From that fight, I experienced the emotional impact of fighting back, a lesson I would later share while recruiting colored men to fight in the Civil War. I escaped from slavery in 1838 at the age of 20. I posed as a free Black sailor wearing a sailor's uniform made in secret by Anna Murray, seamstress and free Black woman who, as, who was soon to be my wife. I boarded a train carrying false credentials bound for ships in Philadelphia. When the conductor asked to see my freedom papers, I responded, "Yes, sir, I have a paper with the American eagle on it that will carry me around the world." Still, I was petrified as I handed the conductor the document. Fear that I might be exposed was my constant traveling companion. The conductor reviewed the document, then handed it back to me without comment. Eventually, I arrived in New York City, was joined by Anna Murray and married. We ultimately settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I found work in the slave or in the shipyard. Shortly after settling in New Bedford, I met with William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist, journalist, suffragist, and social reformer, and joined the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. There, I began to work in earnest as an abolitionist, speaking and writing and exposing the evils of slavery, not only to demonstrate its horrors, but to argue once and for all that slavery was contrary to the moral and political values of the United States. I became a prominent public speaker and spoke so elegantly that some refused to believe that I was an escaped slave. Thus, at a meeting, I exposed my back, bearing the scars of the slave driver's lash, then wrote one of my three autobiographies, exposing myself to the slave catchers. To avoid re-enslavement, I escaped to Europe on August the 16th, 1845, at the age of 27. Supported and protected by friends, I lived, traveled, and spoke at political, social, and religious gatherings in Britain, France, Ireland, and Scotland over a period of 2 years before my friends and admirers raised funds, purchased my freedom, allowing me to return to the US and my family as a free man. Over the years, I became one of the most famous intellectuals of the time, Black or white, advising presidents and lecturing to thousands, covering a range of causes, including women's rights and the Irish Home Rule. I authored 3 autobiographies, becoming one of the best writers of that historic period, with emphasis on the evils of slavery. At the same time, I was much sought after to speak on the raging topic of the era, mainly the Slaveholders Rebellion, which included Black men fighting in the Civil War. Who were these rebellious slaveholders that had seceded from the Union? They were mainly Southern planters who relied heavily or totally on slave labor for their enormous economic growth, prosperity, and way of life. With cash crops of tobacco, cotton, sugarcane, and America's southern states became the economic engine of the growing nation. They, they used their enormous wealth to justify the enslavement of colored people and to justify and support the economic engine of slavery. To keep it that way, they would and did rebel and fight against the Union. Now, I will share excerpts from my speeches, which were delivered at different times to sway public policy and opinion leading up to and during the Civil War. These excerpts will help you see events through my eyes as I saw them and will be reflected in my speeches. The first speech, entitled Slaveholders Rebellion, delivered July 4, 1862, was thought by some to be a stinging criticism of President Lincoln. But little did I know at the time that President Lincoln was contemplating a proclamation of emancipation and that he would sign into law a powerful emancipation measure, the Second Confiscation Act, on July 17, 1862, just 2 weeks after my speech. Note that this new act empowered the President of the United States to use emancipated slaves and freemen in the Union Army in any capacity, including battle. I will quote excerpts from my speech, The Slaveholders Rebellion, delivered July 4, 1862. I come now to the policy of President Lincoln regarding slavery. Now, what has been the tendency of his actions since he became Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy? I do not hesitate to say that whatever has been his intentions, the actions of President Lincoln have been calculated in a marked and decided way to shield and protect slavery from the various blows from which its horrible crimes may have loudly and persistently invited. He has scornfully rejected the policy of arming the slaves, a policy naturally suggested and enforced by the nature and necessities of war. He has steadfastly refused to proclaim, as he has the constitutional and moral right to proclaim, complete emancipation of all the slaves of rebels who should make their way into the line of the army. He has repeatedly interfered with and arrested or halted the anti-slavery policy of some of his most earnest and reliable generals. He has assigned to the most important positions generals who are notoriously pro-slavery and hostile to the party and principles which raised him to power. He has permitted the rebels to recapture their runaway slaves in sight of the nation's capital. And he has, evidently from the first, submitted himself to the guidance of the half-loyal slave states rather than the wise and loyal suggestions of those states upon which must fall and have fallen, the chief expense and danger involved in the prosecution of this war. It is from such action that we must infer the policy of the administration. To my mind, that policy is simply and solely to reconstruct the Union on the cold and corrupting basis of compromise, by which slavery or the slave states shall retain all the power it has ever had and with full assurance of gaining more. The question now arises, is such a reconstruction possible or desirable? To this, I answer from the depths of my soul, no. Mr. Lincoln is powerful. Mr. Lincoln can do many things, but Mr. Lincoln will never see the day when he can bring back or charm back the scattered fragments of the Union into the shape and form they stood before they were shattered by this slaveholding rebellion. You must abolish slavery or abandon the Union. It is plain that there can never be any union between the North and the South, while the South values slavery more than nationality. A union of interest is essential to a union of ideas. And without this union of ideas, the outward form of the union will be but a rope of sand. But it is asking, how will you abolish slavery? You have no power over the system before the rebellion is suppressed, and you will have no power or right when it is suppressed. I will answer this argument when I have stated how the thing will be done. The fact is, there will be no trouble about the way if only the government possessed the will. But several ways have been suggested. One is a stringent confiscation bill by Congress. Another is a proclamation by the president at the head of the nation. Another is by the commanders of each division of the army. There is plausibility in the argument that we cannot reach slavery until we have suppressed the rebellion. Yet, it is far more truer to say that we cannot reach the rebellion until we have suppressed slavery. For slavery is the life of the rebellion. I am convinced that this Confederate rebellion and slavery are twin monsters, and that they must fall or flourish together. But a proclamation of emancipation, says one, would only be a paper order. All loans, all written rules for the government and the army and the navy and people are paper orders, and would remain such were they not backed by force. Still, we do not object to them as useless, but admit their wisdom and necessity. Then these orders carry with them a certain moral force, which makes them, in large measure, self-executing. I know of none which would be or which would possess this self-executing power in larger measure than a proclamation of emancipation. Speech number 2. President Lincoln, true to his word as stated in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued September the 22nd, 1862, and in the final proclamation issued on January the 1st, 1863, opened the door to the abolishment of slavery in the United States with the statement that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state, the designated part of the state, the people whereof, shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. It must be noted that later in the document, President Lincoln proceeds to identify the states and parts of states still in rebellion against the Union. The final proclamation, dated January the 1st, 1863, included 2 significant changes from the preliminary proclamation. 1, it contained no provision for colonization. And 2, it called for the recruitment of Black men into the Union Army and Navy. The destination of the American nation was to change forever. 3 points from the Emancipation Proclamation needs restating. First, President Lincoln put the Confederacy on notice that there would be no compromise over the abolition of slavery. Second, the final proclamation had an unexpected clause. Lincoln invited both colored freemen and freedmen, whom he later referred to as his colored warriors, to join that Civil War fight. Third, clearly, Lincoln and I saw the emancipation as cracking open the door to freedom, letting the Black man rush through in his quest to destroy slavery. Speech number 3. Emancipation Proclaimed, delivered in October 1862. I responded to President Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was dated September the 22nd, 1862, in a speech entitled Emancipation Proclaimed, stating, "Common sense, the necessity of war, to say nothing of the dictation of justice and humanity, have at last prevailed. We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, in his own peculiar, cautious, forbearing, and self-hesitating way, slow, but we hope sure, has, while the loyal heart was near breaking with despair, proclaimed and declared that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or any designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall then be thenceforward and forever free. Forever free? President Lincoln has embraced in this proclamation the law Congress passed more than 6 months ago, prohibiting the employment of any part of the Army and Navy forces of the United States to return future slaves to their masters, and commanded all officers of the Army and Navy to respect and obey its provisions. He has still further declared his intention to urge upon the legislature of all the slave states, not in rebellion, the immediate or gradual abolition of slavery. But read the proclamation, for it is the most important of any to which the President of the United States has ever signed his name. Opinions will differ as to the practical effects of the Emancipation Proclamation upon the war. All the classes at the North who have not lost their affection for slavery will regard the measure as the very worst measure that could be devised. All their plans for the future have been projected with a view of reconstruction of the American government upon the basis of compromise between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. The thought of a country unified in sentiments, objects, and ideas has not entered into their political calculations. And hence, this newly declared policy of the government, which contemplates one glorious homogeneous people doing away at a blow with the whole class of compromisers and corruptors, will meet their stern opposition. Will that opposition prevail? Will it lead the president to reconsider and retract? Not a word of it. Abraham Lincoln may be slow. Abraham Lincoln is not the man, but Abraham Lincoln is not the man to reconsider, retract, and contradict words and purposes solemnly proclaimed over his official signature. No, Abraham Lincoln will take no step back. His word has gone out over the country and the world, giving joy and gladness to the friends of freedom and progress wherever those words are read. And he will stand by them and carry them out to the letter. If he has taught us to confide in nothing else, he has taught us to confide in his word. Speech number 4. Men of Color to Arms, delivered March 2nd, 1863. Recruiting and enlisting Black men to fight in the Civil War became a primary cause of mine. On March the 2nd, 1863, I delivered a recruitment speech entitled Men of Color to Arms. The speech was published later that same month in my newsletter, Douglass's Monthly, as Black men enlisting in the Union Army and Navy responded to my rallying cry. I reprinted or spoke versions of my famous speech on several occasions, and I quote, "When first the rebel cannon shattered the walls of Sumter, I predicted that the war, then and there inaugurated, would not be fought out on entirely by white men. Every month's experience during these 2 dreary years has confirmed that opinion. A war undertaken and brazenly carried on for the perpetual enslavement of colored men, called logically and loudly upon their help to suppress it. Only a moderate share of sagacity or wisdom was needed to see that the arm of the slave was the best defense against the arm of the slaveholder. Hence, with every reverse of the national arm, with every exulting shout of victory raised by the slaveholding rebels, I have implored the imperiled nation to unchain against her foes her powerful Black hand. Slowly and reluctantly, that appeal is beginning to be heeded. There is no time for delay. The tide is at its flood that leads on to fortune. From east to west, from north to south, the sky is written all over, now or never. Liberty won for us by white men would lack half its luster. Who would be free must themselves strike the blow. Better even to die free than to die as slaves. This is the sentiment of every brave colored man amongst us. This emotion, this thought, reminded me of my youth as a slave when in 1833, I spent a year on the farm of the slave breaker Ed Covey. The frequent whippings broke my body, soul, and spirit. Yet I finally rebelled against the beating, fought back, won the fight. After I won the physical confrontation, Ed Covey never tried to beat me again. Next speech. My efforts, those of the abolitionist movement and the lovers of freedom and liberty, were instrumental in the Black men's critical participation of the outcome of the Civil War. During the Civil War, approximately 210,000 colored soldiers and sailors fought under our American flag for union and freedom. They fought for the destruction of slavery and for what President Lincoln termed the nation's new birth of freedom. As part of this cause, approximately 450,000 slaves aided the Union efforts, serving as spies and guides and nurses, building roads and fortifications, and helping lost, wounded, and helpless Union soldiers, Black and white, back to their lives, escaping those deadly Southern prisons. We thank God for the white officers who fought and sacrificed with the colored soldiers. These soldiers, these freedom fighters, whom President Lincoln later referred to as his colored or Black warriors, formed 175 infantry, cavalry, heavy, and light artillery regiments. They fought in 449 separate engagements, of which 41 were major battles. They served in every military theater in the East, the West, the Mississippi Valley, and in the Trans-Mississippi. They entered combat in early 1862 and continued fighting until May 12, 1865 at Palmetto Ranch, Texas. Nearly 40,000 gave their lives for the expanded cause of freedom. They were fighting not only for the abolishment of slavery, but for the full rights of citizenship reflected in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. In conclusion, who was Frederick Douglass? He was a Black man, chiseled by adversity, discrimination, and slavery. He was defined and enhanced by political astuteness and polished and buffeted by self-education and life's experiences. He emerged in a crystallized form, not as a diamond in the rough, but as a brilliant jewel of Black manhood, draped in brotherhood, and motivated to achieve the abolishment of slavery and the expansion of freedom and liberty as expressed in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence and inherited in the United States Constitution, bearing the belief that all people are born with the unalienable rights of freedom and liberty. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was fantastic. That was very insightful throughout Mr. Douglass's life. And audience, if you have questions, just keep typing those in. Bob and I have talked ahead of time, and he's going to answer these questions as Bob Davis and tell you as much as possible about his research and with Frederick Douglass and the colored troops. So, Bob, I want to go back to Mr. Douglass and Mr. Lincoln. They really only met a few times that we know of. The first one, the story kind of goes, as I read, that he stood in line at the White House and you'd have to pass your card forward to get in. And he thought he might have to wait for many days even as a colored man. But tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. It was July of 1863 when Frederick Douglass was going to meet with President Lincoln. Douglass was concerned about the condition for Black soldiers, pay, physical or physical treatment, and also their terms of service. But when on the way to the White House, he met Senator Pomeroy of Kansas, and he and Senator Pomeroy went first to talk with the Secretary of Defense, and then beyond that, they went to talk with President Lincoln. And Douglass says that when they went to talk with President Lincoln, he thought he was going to have to wait all day because some people were standing in line all day. But within 2 minutes of passing his card in, then of course he was introduced into the White House. And in entering the White House, President Lincoln said that, I know who you are, Mr. Douglass. My Secretary of State has told me all about you. Sit down. I'm glad to meet you. And they talked extensively.
They might not have always had agreeing views, sometimes opposing views, but they certainly shared the belief that the country would be greater and better if we had no slavery. So that meeting is very interesting. So the second time that he met Mr. Lincoln was in 1864. Tell us a little bit more about that, if you know.
Well, the second time he met, I know he met with President Lincoln, and he went to. No, this is the time when he went to really talk about the conditions in the war, and they talked extensively. And but President Lincoln used the phrase "my friend." Here comes my good friend Frederick Douglass, he said, as Douglass walks in. And Douglass says to himself, friend, my friend. But anyhow, they sat and they talked extensively. But during that conversation, President Lincoln's secretary came in not once, but twice to announce that Governor Buckingham of Connecticut was waiting to talk with President Lincoln. And President Lincoln told his secretary to tell Governor Buckingham to wait because he wanted to have a long talk with my friend Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass says that they talked for 2 hours. You know, and so that was part of the discussion. But Douglass also said that he and Lincoln, that they had 2 different objectives. That his was to abolish slavery, and that President Lincoln's objective was to lead a nation. And so they had to talk within that context, but they developed a strong leadership. I found, by the way, I found it very interesting when I first started reading about the speech of Slaveholders Rebellion and so on, and the criticism that Douglass made against President Lincoln. I thought that was very interesting because things changed radically as soon as President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, because President Douglass gave multiple speeches really praising what Lincoln had done, even thinking about it in terms of human values and how it impacted the world beyond the United States. So, but anyhow.
And some of the readings that I had done, I seen where Frederick Douglass was a little agitated, I guess, with Mr. Lincoln. He wasn't moving fast enough or as aggressive enough. Frederick Douglass seemed to be, he was a go-getter. I mean, he was passionate, and I can understand that, relate to that. But Mr. Lincoln was very deliberate in most of his actions. So I could see where some of his actions would probably not settle well and be quick enough for Frederick Douglass. So,
well, President Lincoln was quite deliberate, but he was also a politician, and he was very astute.
Yes.
And he knew when to keep his mouth shut, even in terms of not sharing something with the cabinet. And Douglass he said in some of his speeches and some of his writings that at times he didn't really understand some of President Lincoln's decisions. But Lincoln, it's just like, and Lincoln was holding a lot of information and releasing that information strategically. He was a very astute man. Absolutely. And a very smart man.
Absolutely. One of the questions that's come in from the audience tonight, Bob, is what was Mr. Douglass's role in women's suffrage?
On that one, I'm going to have to defer, except to say, though, that he was fairly aggressive in meetings in places like Seneca Falls and so on, where he was pushing and supporting the agenda that was being articulated by some of the leading women. He was very supportive in that sense. But I'm going to have to defer on that question.
That's okay. That's okay. We don't have all the answers to every single one. I think some of the things that I was reading a little bit as well is just that Frederick Douglass was adamant about all people getting equal rights, no matter man, woman, black or white. He wanted everybody to be equal, and he felt as if he could help in the women's suffrage, then that would be helpful for everyone as well. But I could see him taking a stance similar to that.
Well, one thing to keep in mind too is that following the Emancipation Proclamation, then one of the speeches that he gave was a speech entitled "A Glorious Era Has Begun." And at that point, he really reflected heavily and talked heavily about the whole idea about human principles and humanity. And that's where he took the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, and he placed it on a higher plane, because he said that President Lincoln had placed it on a higher plane and focusing on human principles, irrespective of where in the world humanity was located.
Very good. One of the questions that's come in from the audience tonight is, if or when did Frederick Douglass visit Springfield, and what did he do when he was here?
He visited Springfield in 1866. It was a little bit more, 1866. Yeah, well, 1865 actually. 1865. It was a year, more than a year after President Lincoln had been assassinated. He visited Bloomington, and he also visited here. And he spoke at the old state capitol, and spoke very extensively, as a matter of fact. And part of that presentation was geared towards President Lincoln. And he talked about his feelings, but then he also focused on the contribution that President Lincoln had made to mankind. And so, but anyhow, that's when he visited.
One of the questions that kind of tagged along with that is, do you know if he encountered any racial hatred while he was here?
Well, a Black man coming off of slavery, obviously he would have encountered some of that. But at the same time, he brought with him a lot of prestige. And so there was a lot of positive recognition there. And but slavery was an issue, just like blacks, like that's an issue today.
Sure, absolutely. But like you said, very prestigious man, and people really turned out to see his speeches. So, another question that has come in is, recently Frederick Douglass was depicted in a performance titled "The Good Lord Bird." Was this an accurate depiction?
Okay, now that one I don't know about.
Okay, well, we'll have to put something out there. We'll put something out there on our Facebook group. We'll take a look at that, and that's a good resource for us all to kind of learn. So I hadn't heard of that either.
Yeah, I would be interested in seeing or reading about that.
Okay, yeah, that was a good one. Tell us about Frederick Douglass's relationship with Harriet Tubman. I, in doing my research, did find one letter, and I shared that out with the members last week. But tell us a little bit more about their relationship.
Well, I think your letter probably, said it all. The person who really asked that question, of course, is Catherine Harris. But the thing is,
she's out there in the audience.
She's not? Well, she is?
Yeah, she's out there.
Right. Maybe I'll let her just speak to that. But
we'll have to have both of you portray something in the future.
Yeah.
But I mean, in my reading about that is that Frederick Douglass somewhat disagreed with the Underground Railroad, just because he thought it perpetuated the South's angst and working towards freedom. Again, he was just super passionate about everybody getting freedom, and he really didn't want the Underground Railroad to exist, but certainly appreciated it. And like you said in the letter, he was very humbled and very respectful of the work that she was doing.
And I also think too that after the Emancipation Proclamation, then of course he and Harriet Tubman really shared a much more positive view, or he shared a more positive view of President Lincoln that was more akin to what Harriet Tubman had. So, I mean, because the thing is that Douglass and President Lincoln, of course, they emerged or converged at the Emancipation Proclamation, and a lot of things changed after that. I think that Harriet Tubman was much more positive towards the president before then, as opposed to Frederick Douglass. But that one, you know, I don't want to take that one too far.
Sure, sure. One of the questions that's come in from Heather is, who educated Frederick Douglass, and did he ever attend any type of schooling?
No, as a matter of fact, life educated him. His Mrs. Alt, she taught him the letters. As he interacted with the boys on the street, then he developed the sounds. They helped him with his reading, and then all the different. And he was a very perceptive guy, very sharp. The people that he interact with, he used that part of his learning experience, going abroad, working with the Anti-Slavery Society. All of those experiences, led up to things. And even at the point when he was learning to read, he taught some other slaves to read, and that turned out to be a problem for him. But I think that life was his school, and he had the ability to learn from situations, and the way he interpreted them, and he was just a lifelong learner. That's why I think that in his final years, when he received a visit from a young man who asked him what should he be doing, and he told the young man to agitate, agitate, agitate. See, he was still thinking in those terms because he saw the long-term trend between liberty as reflected in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and then tracking that over time. When you looked at the different discussions and debates that were taking place within the United States Congress, going back, for example, and looking at the Missouri Compromise of 1821, and then the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. All of those were debates that were taking place between the forces of freedom and liberty, and they were reflected within the United States Congress. And slavery was garnering a lot of support over that period. You saw it even in the United States Supreme Court in that ruling in 1858. And then, of course, there was a Civil War that broke out in 1861. So, and those clashes were taking place, and Douglass was analyzing that. So he could see the historic trend, and he could articulate it very well.
Yes, very intellectual. It was very intellectual and moral agitation. Yeah. In the good words of John Lewis, it was the good trouble. He was trying to make the good trouble and making good things happen for everyone then. One of the questions that's come in from the audience is, did Frederick Douglass ever meet Mary Lincoln?
After the president's assassination, Mary Douglass sent Frederick Douglass the president's walking stick, saying that he always wanted Frederick Douglass to happen, from a friend to a friend. So she sent that to him. Now, whether they had talked or met before then, I'm unclear on that particular point. Obviously, he had met with the president, but she was well aware of him, and obviously well aware of President Lincoln's feelings towards Frederick Douglass. And that was reflected in the cane, the president's walking stick, that was given to Frederick Douglass by Mary Lincoln.
Could you speak to Frederick Douglass's religion? Was he a religious man in any way?
I don't know how religious he was, but I think he saw the hypocrisy in religion. I mean, the thing is that how could people, these so-called Christians and so on, people of faith, treat other human beings the way in which they were treating other human beings. How could they support slavery, for example? And so I think in a lot of ways he walked away from the church.
We have a ton of questions. We just have a couple more that I'll get to. Speaking of Miss Catherine Harris, she is out there and she says, what books, what would you recommend one book on Douglass besides his autobiographies? Which ones do you encourage people to read?
There's a book entitled Giants. As a matter of fact, it's about both Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. The author, John Stauffer, says that Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, that they were the two giants of the 19th century. Their lives were parallel. The fact that Douglass was a slave, born a slave, and had, and had no formal schooling. Of course, Lincoln was born, he was dirt poor, had less than a year of formal schooling. But somehow they both ended up in different locations, miles away, studying the same books, studying the Bible and so on, and developing those skills. And they both had a feeling that irrespective of what life deals to you, then there are certain things that you are expected to do during your time on earth. And they both phrase it the same way, coming from different perspectives. And so that's one of the things that Stauffer talks about. But the book Giant, I think is really a really good book. The Radical and the Republican, that's also a very good book. And then the books by David Blight, just outstanding. As a matter of fact, there are two more that I'm going to read. But Blight, for example, if you want something that's purely on Douglass, I would say David Blight, and I would also say read his autobiography.
Those are all good selections. I know The Giant is for sure on my reading list, so I hope to get to that in 2021. Yeah. So again, Bob, I just want to thank you so much. I know I speak for the entire audience out there that this was absolutely fantastic. I learned a lot more about Mr. Frederick Douglass, as well as a new appreciation for the U.S. colored troops as well. Just a reminder that tonight's presentation is being recorded. We'll send everyone a link in your email tomorrow. You can also check it out on our YouTube page at any time. We encourage you to share it with others in your life. So you can also encourage them to become a member so that they can enjoy these same benefits monthly. And speaking of membership, now is a great time to buy a gift membership for a family friend or a family member. As well as gifts. If you're thinking about other gifts, our museum store is open online. You can place your order and get a 15% discount by using discount code Lincoln15 at checkout. So that discount is open for anybody out there. So get your gifts now. Free shipping over $50. It can't be guaranteed before Christmas, but you can still place your order. We also want to make sure that you're aware of all the upcoming virtual programming that is made exclusively to our members. January 13th, Dr. Christian McWhorter will be interviewing Dr. Peter Carmichael to discuss his book, The War on the Common Soldier. And then January 26th, we'll be joined by David Wiegers. Many of you might know him from our Facebook group. He is a photographer and has extensive knowledge on Lincoln statues. So we'll be looking forward to that. In February, we will be introducing the new CEO and president of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation, Aaron Mast. We also have another author, as well as Justin Blandford from the Old State Capitol. So we have lots of programming coming up. If you haven't registered for them, please do, and we'll be sending out more throughout the end of the year and up into 2021. So as we close out tonight, there is a short survey. If you could take that, it helps us to understand what we can do better and what speakers you'd like to see in the future. So again, thank you so much. We appreciate your support. If you can make a contribution, go to our website, alplm.org, and help us to carry on Mr. Lincoln's legacy. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. We wish you well, and we will see everyone in 2021. And thanks again, Bob.
Okay, you're quite welcome.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Good
Thank you.
night.